Welcome to Gata Press. Today we're discussing how the U.S. counter-cartel campaign in Latin America echoes its counterterrorism legacy. The global war on terror was characterized by open-ended commitments, the erosion of civil liberties in partner nations, and the destabilization of entire regions under the banner of security. The early events such as Maduro's arrest on narco-terrorism charges, the Cuba designation as terrorist and cartel kingpin, unaccounted extrajudicial killings at sea, are consistent with the GWAT's opening phase. As the U.S. pivots to a hemispheric war on cartels, via Operation Total Extermination, whose blueprint are outlined in an official document which suggests that Latin America is set to inherit the same neo-colonial legacy of permanent military presence and strategic, economic subordination that defined the last 2 decades in the Middle East. The Department of War's 2026 posture statement, delivered by Acting Assistant Secretary Joseph M. Humire, outlines a fundamental restructuring of U.S. defense priorities centered on the American homeland and hemisphere first. While framed as a defensive strategy to counter narco-terrorism and seal borders, an analysis of the operational methods, strategic language, and geopolitical objectives reveals a blueprint for sustained, intrusive intervention across Latin America and the Caribbean. By explicitly applying the lexicon and legal frameworks of the global war on terror, pretty much like kinetic strikes, designated terrorist organizations, and coalition of the willing, to cartels and hemispheric adversaries, the United States is establishing a precedent for extra-jurisdictional military action and overlordship. If this counter-cartel strategy follows the trajectory of the counterterrorism legacy, it will result in a neo-colonial design characterized by permanent military access, sovereignty erosion for partner and targeted nations, and the subordination of regional stability to U.S. strategic and economic dominance via Washington consensus, all the while the cartels will thrive like ISIS has done thanks to the U.S. Thus, as the U.S. counter-cartel campaign mirrors the U.S. counter-terrorist legacy, we can expect a neo-colonial design on the region for carving a unipolar sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Cartel labels as a gateway to unilateral military action. The most significant shift documented in the posture statement is the formal conflation of transnational criminal organizations with terrorist entities, enabling the application of counterterrorism authorities in the Western Hemisphere. The document details 45 lethal kinetic strikes, conducted since September 2025 against vessels tied to Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang now designated as a foreign terrorist organization, but that according to Interior Minister Didaso Cabello, before Maduro's abduction a year ago, the gang was already wiped out in 2023. This mirrors the post-9/11 paradigm where the terrorist label served to circumvent traditional constraints on the use of force, and via this invocation of the FTO framework, the Department of War justifies unilateral actions that transcend law enforcement. The statement notes that operations like Operation Southern Spear have shifted drug trafficking routes eastward through Venezuela and Guyana into Suriname. However, in the counterterrorism legacy, such shifts were used to justify expanding the battle space. We can anticipate that if cartels relocate operations, the U.S. will cite sanctuary arguments to pursue them into new territories, demanding expanded basing rights or conducting cross-border operations without the consent of fragile governments, thereby treating Latin American nations as a contiguous battle space rather than a collection of sovereign states. Institutionalizing a permanent military footprint through burden sharing. The document emphasizes burden sharing and partnership, but a deeper reading reveals a strategy of institutionalizing a permanent U.S. military presence under the guise of capacity building. The operationalization of the Americas Counter-Cartel Coalition is presented as a cooperative effort as 18 nations convened at the inaugural Americas Counter-Cartel Conference at Southcom, where they signed a joint declaration committing to collective intelligence sharing, border security, and operational coordination to dismantle cartel networks. Leaders from across the hemisphere issued a unified warning that cartels must be treated as terrorist organizations and that confronting this transnational threat requires shared regional action. Yet, the conditions attached to this coalition are explicitly neo-colonial in nature, with partner nations expected to align their defense postures with U.S. priorities, accept U.S.-led operational planning, and provide access to key terrain. This is most evident part in the document is the Panama Canal section. The Dow cites successes such as Panama withdrawing from China's Belt and Road Initiative and expelling a Chinese firm from port operations, replacing it with U.S. subsidiaries. Simultaneously, the U.S. has established a joint security cooperation group on the Pacific side and a jungle operations training course on the Atlantic side. This creates a permanent, bilateral security architecture that protects U.S. commercial interests under the guise of counter-cartel cooperation. The pattern replicates the enduring bases established in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were initially sold as temporary training missions. Given the legacy of counterterrorism, we can expect these cooperation groups and training courses to evolve into de facto U.S. forward operating bases, locking Panama, Puerto Rico, and similar nations like Ecuador and Paraguay, where new status of forces agreements are being signed, into a long-term security dependency that prioritizes U.S. economic and strategic dominance over national sovereignty. Furthermore, the post-Operation Absolute Resolve strategy in Venezuela, where a military operation supported the arrest of Nicolas Maduro, is evidence of a dangerous precedent in the use of U.S. military power to effect regime change or enforce U.S. judicial rulings. The subsequent stabilization phase, led by the State Department but supported by the Dow, involves leveraging the private sector to rebuild the economy. Historically, such stabilization efforts in counterterrorism theaters such as Iraq, Afghanistan, before U.S. pullout, Libya and Syria resulted in a restructuring of local economies to favor U.S. corporate interests and the imposition of governance structures compliant with U.S. strategic goals. In Venezuela, this suggests a model where military intervention clears the path for economic neocolonialism, restructuring the nation's oil and private sectors to benefit U.S. stakeholders. The counter-cartel campaign is being built using the same legal frameworks and methods that define the GWT.